Hello, my name is Daria Orlowska. I'm the data librarian here at Waldo Library, and today I will be guiding you through how to prepare for your projects more effectively through using data workflows. Even if you're not collecting your own data, or if you're preparing for a project that involves things you might not normally consider to be data, like medieval manuscripts or videos or photographs, this workshop is still for you. Hopefully, by the end of the hour, you will have learned some strategies as you move from creating your research ideas to breaking it up into pieces to further refine it and set up project documents that will allow you to be more thoughtful and organized in your projects. At the end of the workshop, you will be able to identify your project needs. This includes what data you are working with and what your research workflow might look like. Learn how to break down your research question into components that will allow you to investigate what has already been done on the topic and also be better at articulating with what you are hoping to investigate as part of your project. Visualize your goals through a workflow by bringing the pieces of the project together into one cohesive picture. You will also learn how to refine this picture better to fit your needs. And finally, you will use your big picture workflow to construct your research documents so that you are more organized and prepared to jump into the meat of the project. There's a lot of information in this workshop, so if at any point you feel like you would like some more hands-on support, you are more than welcome to reach out to me after this workshop is done so we can sit down and discuss your data needs if you'd like to talk about them specifically for your own project. I will also try to pause at the end of each section to allow for reflection and questions. But if you don't hear me do that, feel free to type it into chat and I will read them as they come in. So without further ado, let's jump right in. Identify your project needs. First, let's talk about what data you might be working with so that we can begin thinking about your project needs. Depending on your research project, you may find that you're dealing with primary data, secondary data, or both. In general, primary data is collected by you during the active research phase and is used to answer a specific question within that project. It's typically what most people think about when they think of conducting research, is collecting your own data. The benefits of primary data collection is that you have full control over the methodology. You know what you're measuring, you know the process and the focus of that data collection. You've written it all out, so you have a sense of knowing what it looks like from start to finish and the decisions you have made regarding that methodology. Because you set the parameters and follow a procedure, you know that you are measuring what you think you're measuring, which is validity, and you are measuring things consistently, hopefully, which is called reliability. Collection is taking place with up-to-date measurement techniques. So you're not using measurement techniques that were popular 20 years ago. It's what's being used in the field right now. And your things are um, being collected with regards to current situations. So maybe you're specifically interested in reactions to a certain event that happened recently. And you have the flexibility to ask questions that may not have been asked before in the field. So if you're collecting your own research, you don't have to be limited to what other people have asked. Obviously, you will probably be looking at that literature to have some informed decisions about what questions you want to be asking, but you're not limited to only questions that have been asked in the past. On the flip side, secondary data is collected or can be collected by you in a previous project, and you might be reusing that data collection to answer a different question, or they could have been collected by someone else entirely. Reusing data that has already been collected means that you can spend less time and money collecting data from scratch. And you can potentially look at larger, more representative data sets than you could collect yourself. For example, You do not have the same resources as the United States government collecting census data. They have more authority and they have more resources to push that out, and individuals trust them more with answering those kinds of questions. And so, if you want to know about demographics of a large body of people, you're better off reusing secondary data that has already been collected for a specific purpose in your research, because you are not going to be able to collect data on that same scale as the United States government can. Sometimes you can also combine data sets together so that things are more representative. So maybe data has been collected on a specific population by one researcher and then also collected on that same specific population, but it's individuals that fit within that population in a different state, for example, and you can combine those data sets together to make it more representative of a larger group of people. See, so other than it being more representative or combining data, using data from other projects gives the data set a new life, advancing science by building on someone else's work to ask different questions or replicate their results. There are benefits and drawbacks to each type of data, and you may find that using one or both might work best to fit your needs. There's not really any right way of approaching this. It just depends on your needs and timeline and the amount of resources you have at your disposal as you're beginning your project. Depending on your discipline, your data types may vary wildly, and so I wanted to provide an example of what that might look like. So when it comes to primary data, collecting data that has not been collected before as part of your project, such as surveying a population, recording field observations, examining an MRI for the presence of certain cells, interviewing a group of people, or capturing images are all examples of that primary data collection. Those things that haven't existed and you went out and collected and did those procedures to get that information back. And then you have secondary data. So using data that you might have collected for another purpose, such as maybe you did a survey on happiness within a certain town, and while you were surveying these individuals, you had asked them about maybe the food that they eat and their likes and dislikes. And then you took that data and you analyzed the food that they ate to look at healthy eating habits. And so that wasn't the major purpose of your original study, but you're repurposing that data, and so now it becomes secondary data. You might be combining census statistics, using a data set someone else has published, such as like you're looking at articles and there's an associated data set, and now you want to use that data set to answer your own questions, or conducting a review of literature, whether that's a secondary data analysis or a systematic data review or a meta-analysis. And these are all examples of secondary data, so reusing data that already exists. Some projects, like modeling real-life phenomena based on experimental data or text mining a literature corpus, can fall between these two categories of primary and secondary data, depending on their context and depending how you think about it. So, depending on what data you have decided to use in your project, you may find that your overall process, your overall research process might change. With primary data, your option is pretty much come up with a question and then collect your data. You don't really want to collect your data first and then ask your questions based on that collected data. That's typically bad research practice. You don't want to kind of influence what you've already collected or try to fit the data to a question or to a specific answer. So you really just have one pathway with primary data, question first and then collect your data. However, with secondary data, there are two approaches to how you want to start your procedure. You may choose to treat it like primary data in that you come up with a question first and then find a data set to answer the question. This is typically how most people start off with reusing secondary data, but you may find that the data you're looking for doesn't exist or doesn't exactly address what you're interested in looking at, resulting in you having to go back and revise your questions based on the data that you have available. Or you might try to keep looking for it and still not find anything. So it is a little challenging doing this first strategy. On the other hand, you can find a data set on a topic of interest first and then formulate your questions based on that available data. This is a faster process because you're operating within the constraints of a data set. So within all the methodology that they've set up and all its limitations, and because you're already aware of that when you're formulating your questions, that means less revisions to your questions. However, that could also mean that your questions might be more narrow in scope than if you chose the other option because the sky isn't the limit anymore, right? You're constraining yourself to factors within the data set. So depending on your needs, your research workflow may end up taking a more iterative path than you expect, and that's okay. You may find that after you look through the literature and develop your question, so this path right here, after looking through the literature and developing your question, you might jump back into the literature and to identify if you're actually addressing a gap or identifying something in a novel way. And then you go back to developing your question, set up your project documents, and you might choose to do find data that already exists and analyze it. Or you may choose to start off with going through a literature search, developing your question, looking at secondary data, and then deciding that the questions that you want to answer haven't actually been answered or don't exist in a format that's usable for your needs, and so you go out and collect your own primary data before doing analyses. You may maybe it's not just that they don't exist, but things are not up to date, and you want to be able to answer the questions as others are answering them right now. So there's a lot of different ways that this research workflow can proceed depending on your needs. Like I said, there's no right way, and it might be very different than how someone else approaches it. So before we move on to the next section, I want you to take a moment and consider what data needs do you have in your current or upcoming project? Do you anticipate working with primary or secondary data? And what might your research process look like? Next, let's look at breaking down your question. Now that we have a sense of what our project needs could look like, let's break it down into components to get a better sense of our data needs. Let's start off with this basic question. I would like to find data that will help me answer the question if public liberal universities are more diverse. What do we think of this question? What are some things that jump out at you about it? And how are some ways that we can make it more specific? So you have a few different components that we can look at just off the get-go, right? Um, you have public liberal universities. So you have something very specific here, public as opposed to private, for example, liberal, maybe as opposed to conservative, universities. Is that for your institutions? Are more, so you're comparing diverse. And what do we mean by diversity? And how do we quantify that, right? Like what are the things that we're looking at? Are we looking at numbers? Are we looking at graduation rates? Are we looking at enrollments? So let's see if we can break this down. When I think about the question, are public liberal universities more diverse? I think there are actually two questions. How many diverse students are currently enrolled in public versus private universities? And how does this compare between places that are conservative versus liberal? Refining the question based on data that you may expect to be able to find is a good starting point. For example, measuring how liberal a university is might be challenging because it might require surveying university affiliates' political stance or how they voted, which to my knowledge, it does not really exist. I don't think you can go out there and say, how did the student population and the faculty and staff at Western Michigan University vote in the past election? That information doesn't usually exist. However, you can probably find relevant statistics if you use university location as a proxy for how liberal an area is. So instead of saying, how did people in Western Michigan University vote? What were their voting habits? Instead, we look at the election results of, let's say, the 2020 election and and see what percentage of Kalamazoo voted Democrat versus Republican and use that as a proxy. Breaking down the question into multiple parts can also help with scope creep, making it more manageable to accomplish within a time frame. So let's break this down even more because we came up with two questions based on this one question which are more specific, but we can get even more specific here because some of these phrases that we're using are still quite vague and could be specified even further. So, when you say diverse, do you mean racial minority? Do you mean LGBTQ? What are some words that you might be using to mean the same phrase? When you say students, do you mean graduates, undergraduates, or both? Or more specific, like do you mean first year students or first generation students? When you say enrolled, do you mean full-time, part-time, both? And I think there's been some choices with these two questions already, like admitted versus enrolled. And enrolled will also work with students, right, in this case. So depending on which student you're looking at, undergraduates or maybe even first year enrollment is you're going to get different statistics than students who have graduated from an institution. When you say university, do you mean any degree granting institute? Or do you need to narrow your criteria based on what type of students you want to include? So are you looking at maybe just granting undergraduate degrees, granting undergraduate and graduate, or maybe it's just a 2-year program? When it comes to place, what is the smallest unit of data location that you're interested in looking at? Cities within a state, between states, within the entire country, between countries. So in this case, are you interested in looking at universities within a city like Kalamazoo, which might not be the best option because we have Western Michigan and we have K College, and that's only two comparisons there. And maybe we want something wider. So maybe we want to look at our full state. So Michigan, how many universities are in Michigan? Is that feasible? How about if you're looking at multiple states, like if you're looking at the Midwest, how many universities is that? How easy is it to get that information? And even further, if you're going to like the country level or even like between countries, that might start, your scope is creeping right there, right? It's going to take you more and more time to aggregate that information because information might not be aggregated in that way. It might be more difficult to find. So, how will this level of geography impact what data is available? And how will the smallest unit of location affect standardization? So countries may collect similar information, but might have different criteria for thresholds or collection, or even provide information in different units, which might make comparison difficult. So if we were to look at liberal and conservative in regards to different countries, they might be measuring those differently. Even with the way that we handle reporting at the university level of like percentage of minorities enrolled, that might not be something that other countries are looking at. So you run into some standardization issues there, and that's something to also keep in mind. And finally, how does conservative versus liberal mean? What does it mean? Does it mean voting habits or opinions on certain issues, right? Can you like use gun control as an issue and whether or not someone is for or against that within a city as a proxy to measure the same thing? And how will this definition change based on what place you're interested in looking at? So these are some ways that you can take a very broad question that you may initially have, break it down into smaller questions, and then break your keywords down into phrases so that you have a sense of what you're interested in and what are some other words that you could be using in your search. So, like I said, considering synonyms for your question can help generate multiple search criteria for a wider or broader search, or something that is more narrow, and help you specify what terms you're not interested in looking at. So, for example, when we are looking at students, that's kind of a broad term. If we want to make it more narrow, we can say undergraduate college students, and maybe we can even make it more narrow by saying first year enrolled students. And we can also define what we're not interested in. So we're not interested in high school students. We might not be interested in graduate students. These searches can then be used to look through the literature to see what work has already been done if you are at that part of your research search, and or you can use it to inform your search for secondary data, or you could use it for both. Thinking it through, I think, is a good step in this process. Sometimes coming up with related terms or synonyms can be challenging because different disciplines may have different names for the same thing, or terms used in the field by researchers can be very different than terms used colloquially. A good tool to use is a thesaurus built into a database that you're using. For example, you have here, let me get my laser pointer out. You have Eric, and Psych Info and MESH, which is medical subject headings, that's through PubMed, are all examples of data sets with thesauri. They have things that are already built in that you can use to look at what the term means, what are some broader terms and related terms. ICPSR, which is a data repository, also has a thesaurus that might be helpful to look for narrow and broader terms or related terms. The liaisons at WMU have also come up with a brainstorming keyword guide right here if you need help getting started. And of course, you can always schedule consultation with your subject librarian for personalized support on your project if you really aren't sure where to start from. They can give you some good guidance about what data sets what databases you should be looking at, like how you should be thinking about your search terms, what your keywords are, and what are some good synonyms for you. So before we move on to the next section, I want you to take a moment and consider what your research question is. Can you split it up into several questions? Have you defined your main terms? And if you don't have a question yet, consider our example question, which is the public liberal universities, are they more diverse than maybe conservative private universities or something of that nature? What is something that could be defined better about what we already looked at? And can you expect to find all that data within that question that we're asking within one source? Or will you need multiple data sources? So take a moment to think about that before we proceed. Bonus, secondary data matching. You might remember earlier in the workshop how we talked about an additional step that comes with secondary data, checking to make sure that the information you're looking for actually exists and if it measures the things you're actually interested in examining. Regardless if you find your secondary data set before or after you form your research question, there is always some matching that needs to occur as you realign your expectations with what you have available. So let's continue looking at our example research question and seeing what sources we have available. So in our sample research question, the first question we asked is how many diverse students are currently enrolled in four-year universities? The National Center for Educational Statistics offers information on undergraduate enrollment at four-year universities by race ethnicity through the College Navigator. In this example, we narrowed down the offerings to institutes in Michigan for a more manageable project that will still require legwork to compile statistics, as undergraduate enrollment by race ethnicity is not available in the downloadable spreadsheet of all the institutions in a given region. So, if we look at our data here, we can see that here are some of our variables that we're interested in. We can use the College Navigator to look at a state, Michigan, and then we can specify that we're interested in public-private four-year institution that award bachelor and advanced degrees. And we can get a list of institutions and we can download that data, but it's not actually going to include all the data we're interested in within the downloadable spreadsheet. For that, we need to access each of the universities separately. So this is a page to show that. When we access this information separately for each university, we have the university name, we get the location, which is the city and the state, we have the university type, four-year private, um, then we have the raw number of undergraduate students within who have attended the university within the past year, usually. It will say in the documentation. And then if we scroll further down, we get some information about undergraduate race and ethnicity. So we're actually going to have to do some math with this, right? Because the way that it's split up, you have it split up by white right here, and then you have like two or more ethnicities, unknown, and non-resident alien. So we could say maybe in our definition that we're defining diverse as not white, unknown ethnicity, or non-resident. And in that case, we want to add these percentages and subtract them from 100 to get a percentage of diverse individuals, and then multiply that by our raw number to get a raw number of undergraduates who are diverse within that university. The second question we asked is how is enrollment varying based on the political leanings of a city that the university is located in? We decided that we were going to use voting habits in the most recent election as a proxy for that information. And one way to get that information would be to use the New York Times 2020 election map to identify the voting habits of the jurisdiction that the institute is located in. This also requires a little bit of legwork, but if you remember in our previous page, we looked at Adrian University, which is located in the city of Adrian in Michigan. And if we advance the slide, you can see that we have the jurisdictions within the city and how they voted. So at this point, you can see Adrian College, sorry, not Adrian College, not Adrian University. Adrian College is located within this region, and 54% of individuals living here in this one little section voted Democrat and 44% voted Republican. However, not all individuals who attend Adrian College live in this tiny little shape, right? They might live all over the city, in which case it might be worth saying, okay, take the boundaries of this city and do this calculation for all the jurisdictions within it to see how, in general, the city voted. Maybe you make a decision about like just looking at the color. Okay, they voted mostly Democrat. Maybe you want something more specific. Okay, the average is 60% Democrat, 40% Republican. But those are things that you need to go ahead and set the parameters for, and so that you know that you're collecting it the same way for the other universities that you look at. Visualize goals through workflow. Now that we have broken down our project goals, let's bring them back together to visualize the bigger picture using a workflow. Why you guys came to this workshop today. Creating a workflow document can be a helpful tool to identify and to account for what variables relate to what sources, how those sources are connected, and what can be used as an identifier. In this example, we might expect to use two sources. So the NCES College Navigator, the first source that we looked at, and then the New York Times precinct level 2020 elections, to get statistics on enrollment for each university in Michigan, as well as statistics on how residents in those university cities voted in the most recent election. Based on how numbers are reported in these sources, we can expect to have one derived variable here, enrolled minority, because remember we have a raw number for undergraduates enrolled and then percentages of minority at the university. So we'll need to use some math in order to get this variable. We also talked about potentially having another variable for election results, right? That might be derived if you want to look at like one jurisdiction results or the entire city or maybe something else entirely. And since we're not looking at changes over time, we don't have to take into consideration availability of data by year for each of these sources. So this is what we're kind of looking at and working with. You see all the variables are written out, you kind of have derived variable and you have them connected to sources. And you see that city is our identifier in that, well, our linking variable in this case, and the name of the university is our identifier. However, we can be more granular than this. We can do better at documenting and figuring out what we want to work with. So creating a workflow document is a great place to introduce data management and documentation. Using this space to elaborate on previous structures by considering things like data type, coming up with variable names, and keeping track of any data decisions that were made, such as including only four-year universities, and maybe also like putting derived from these two variables it's a great place to document this kind of information. A workflow is a living document that will evolve as you consider your project needs. And so feel free to use it as a place to write down your questions as you figure out what information is essential for your project. So in this case, one of our questions that we talked about is that the New York Times only provides a spreadsheet with precinct data. Do we need an extra variable to connect precinct to city? Or how are we classifying election results, right? Do we need to look at doing an average of the entire city results? Or can we just look at a subset of it? Or can we just look at the color? So before we move on to the next section, I want you to take a moment and consider how you normally prepare for a project. How does this data workflow compare to steps you may already take, either in your head or writing them out? What are some ideas that you can take from this example and integrate into your process moving forward that might make brainstorming a new project easier? Take a few minutes to think about that. Now we're at the home stretch, constructing research documents. We have our outline, we have the basis of our project. We had started off with a very vague question. We broke it down. We found some search terms. We found some sources. We compared our needs to the sources. We created a workflow and we've really defined and narrowed down what variables we're looking at, what that might look like, what happens when we collect it, right? Like, how do we want to document it? How do we want to code it? How does it relate to other variables? Now, let's take what we learned to construct our research document structures. Since the data workflow is an activity that maps the variables that we are interested in within our project, it lends itself very well for setting up data collection documents, such as Excel spreadsheets or SPSS files. We've already brainstormed some simple names for each piece of data, and we can use those as headers, right? Like, we've come up with unique and informative but short variable names. Just put those in. Those are your column titles. We can decide on the variable order with our unique variables, such as the institution names or IDs, being at the head. Those are our keys, so our unique identifiers. And those are placed within the first column to make it easy to tell each row of information apart from another. We might also set up controlled entry, which limits what can be entered within a column cell and can offer helpful advice in a pop-up window. So in this case, you have here, this is just a random example that doesn't have anything to do with our sample question, but for here you have population type, and you see urban and city. There's an input which tells us what things we can expect to enter into that cell. It says urban or rural, um, and someone entered city, and that brought up a pop-up window that said, no, that's not a valid entry. You need to enter either urban or rural. So having this kind of controlled entry is super helpful when you're working with other people to make sure that they're being consistent, or even if you're working by yourself and you have just a lot of entry to do, because then you know for sure that you're being consistent and you're not introducing outliers. Um, and it also helps you identify parameters ahead of time. So it helps you think about, okay, I have this thing that I'm entering and I'm entering percentages, so it must be between 0 and 100, for example. So being very clear about like what you're expected to entry can be helpful because it helps later on. You don't have to do as much data cleanup. You know everything is good to go. Next, is after setting up the data collection document, we can begin our documentation. Notes to ourselves that will help us throughout the project to stay on track and create an easily understood data set. A coding manual, such as the one pictured right here, is a good way to document what variables we are including in our data sets. Are there valid parameters, where they're coming from, and how might we be modifying them to fit our purposes? So in this case, the coding manual tells you what the file is that we're interested in, when it was finalized, some general information about how coding was conducted. So if you used maybe missing data or non-applicable cells, or if you were listing unique variables. And then you have the variable description. So you'll notice that this is very similar to how we set up our workflow documents. We have like our variable name that's short and condensed, We have where it's located, which was not in our workflow document, but you'll have that information once you start inputting it into your spreadsheet. A full description of what that variable entails, what type of variable that is. So is it a string? Is it an integer? Is it categorical? If you have any missing values, like what's the reason for that? Can we expect these variables to be missing and why? How many non-missing variables there are? This is something that you'll be able to put in at the end of your project after you've already coded everything and finished the spreadsheet. It might not be something that you're able to put in ahead of time, but it's good to put it in to have it as a placeholder. And then some additional notes for yourself. So you might say, okay, this is a categorical variable. So like we saw before, we had rural and urban. And so maybe we can do a count how many urban entries there are within the spreadsheet. Other documentation that could be useful at this point might be a README document that explains how all the project files are connected. A procedures document that writes out instructions on how to conduct the project, or file naming conventions that ensures that all the files within the project follow a convention that are consistent and easily located. So down here is an example of a file naming system, Pat's draconian and non-negotiable naming system. This is for several projects, but it's really helpful sometimes to write out, like, if you're naming a file, like what are all the types of file names? If it's a spreadsheet, then you want to include this. If it's an image, you want to include this. And here are your options so that you have kind of a list of options that you can point to and choose from instead of trying to come up with something on the fly. It will make finding your files so much easier for yourself. And last, setting up any structures that you anticipate that your project might need. This may include things like creating subfolders where the files will live, so file structures. Creating pseudocode that maps out the different functions you might need if you are programming. Creating a lab notebook or field notes with pre-planned sections to fill in project information. Setting up surveys and Qualtrics that you might be using to gather primary data, and that will also be used, like as in this an example, when you're submitting your project proposal to the IRB for approval. You'll want to save this as a PDF and also upload it so that they know like which questions are forced response, or do you have all the components like your informed consent? Did you turn on anonymized responses if you're not collecting identifiers? And also creating a regulatory binder if you're dealing with human subjects research that will keep your study materials and procedures organized and point to file locations, both as a reference for study staff and any future study auditors. So before we wrap up this workshop, I want you to take a moment and consider, what documents do you anticipate needing for your future or current projects? What are some pain points about creating these structures that you encountered in the past? And how can you make these procedures more smooth for yourself in the future? And with that, thank you so much for your time. I hope that you feel better equipped to prepare for your projects and that you will try out creating data workflows as you consider your data needs in the future. If you enjoyed this workshop, I have 3 other data workshops coming up this semester. On February 20th, I will provide greater details onto how to document and manage your data. On March 13th, we will get into the best ways to set up or reorganize your data within spreadsheets. And on April 13th, or April 3rd, we will do some hands-on work preparing data for analysis. All my previous workshop recordings can be found on the library's YouTube page if you're looking for some more immediate data learning, or if you missed one of these workshops, if you're watching in the future, hello, and would like to revisit these concepts on your own or follow this series on your own. And of course, if you're looking for more help with your project, please reach out. I am more than happy to provide some customized support. We can sit down, we can look at what variables you're interested in. We can write out a workflow together. I can ask you some targeted questions as you figure things out. I hope to see you again soon.